A little bit of background about redesigning cities and the past 51 episodes. We are now on 52, as well as two untitled images that we'll get to later, but that maybe help set the stage a little bit. Welcome everyone to episode 52 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. I'm your host, Ellen Dunham-Jones, a professor in the School of Architecture, where I direct the MS in Urban Design. Today, our topic is Atlanta's Sweet Auburn, preserving the spaces and stories of the Civil Rights Movement. Located in the old Fourth Ward neighborhood, Sweet Auburn was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1976 as, quote, a prime example of the flourishing segregated neighborhoods founded by African Americans during the Jim Crow era in the South. The neighborhood was home to countless businesses, congregations, and social organizations, and was the birthplace of Martin Luther King. In his new book, Civil Sites, shown here, and for sale at the book signing, Gene Kansas walks us through Sweet Auburn and tells the stories of the civil rights movement through its buildings, occupants, and achievements. Honestly, as an architect who actually lives very close to Sweet Auburn, I thought I knew a lot about Sweet Auburn, and then until I read the book and realized how little I knew. But I also have never quite seen a book tell the stories through the buildings in anything close to the same way. It's really a remarkable book. After his presentation, Clay Kiningham, illustrator of the book, Jackie Royster, Bill Stanley, and I will discuss the lessons for designers, developers, and activists. So, some introductions. I'm delighted that Jacqueline Jones Royster, former dean of the Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts at Georgia Tech, and is professor emerita at both Ohio State University and Georgia Tech, has come back to join us. Dr. Royster has received several prestigious awards. I list a little bit some of those here, as well as her most recent book publications, Making the World a Better Place, African American Women Advocates, Activists, and Leaders from 1773 to 1900, Finding Sarah and Mary, Unraveling History from the Ground Up in Middle Georgia, and The First Ship, Using Inquiry Strategies to Retell an Undertold Story. Welcome back, Jackie. We also have William J. Stanley III. Bill is the principal for design for Stanley Love Stanley PC, along with his wife, Ivenue Love Stanley. Both were the first Black architects and first female Black architect ever to graduate from Georgia Tech in architecture. Based in Atlanta, the firm is one of the oldest African-American architectural practices in the country. Amongst many honors, in 1995, Bill received the AIA's Whitney M. Young Jr. Citation, the Institute's highest honor to the country's most socially conscious architect. A leader and activist architect, he has served as president of both the National Organization of Minority Architects and 100 Black Men of Atlanta, served on numerous boards, and contributed to Sweet Auburn with the design of the Horizon Sanctuary, which is across the street from and housing the Ebenezer Baptist Church congregation as it continues the legacy of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., now under Reverend and Senator Raphael Warnock. Clay Kiningham is an architect and the illustrator of Civil Sites. Clay also graduated from Georgia Tech, kind of a trend this week. He received the MARC program's Top Designer Award and teaches studios when he isn't practicing architecture with Gentle Works. Clay is also an award-winning artist for his commitment to preserving history through art and drawing. Yes, Gene Kansas is also a Georgia Tech grad, but in digital media. Nonetheless, he and Clay both took my Theories of Urban Design class several moons ago, and I'm delighted to welcome them back as tonight's episode is doubling as a Theories of Urban Design class meeting. There may be a quiz. Gene merges storytelling and real estate with a cultural focus. As CEO of Gene Kansas Commercial Real Estate, an award-winning brokerage and development firm focusing on historic preservation, he has spent more than 2 decades championing the creative side of commercial real estate. He was host of Sidewalk Radio on AM 1690 for 5 seasons, and as author of Civil Sites, Gene leverages the built environment to share the illuminating history of the civil rights movement in Atlanta's Sweet Auburn Historic District. Gene, come on up to the podium and talk to us about this book.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Georgia Tech. Thank you all for having me here. It's an honor. Also, of course, to be with you, Clay, and Jackie, and Bill. What a treat. I am going to present just real quick. Ellen mentioned that I have a master's in digital media from Georgia Tech. I have not been part of a single presentation that involved technology where there wasn't some hiccup. I was more interested in mediums, but I had a crack crew helping out, so I think we're good. This is going to be about spaces and places as mediums for social change, and got some good insight from Ellen. I got a lot of help from Clay, making me look about 14 and a half years younger in this. And this was only drawn 14 months ago. I do historic preservation, lead a company of leaders in that space, and then commercial real estate with a cultural focus. And so what is commercial real estate with a cultural focus? One, I believe that if we're on the planet, we're in real estate. We're all sharing this planet. We all have a relationship to it. We have a relationship to each other. We have neighbors. And I think it's important to consider and be considerate of our neighbors. And so when you're thinking about being in real estate and then with a cultural focus, Price Gilbert and Georgia Tech, really, its campus and this room are examples of this, because this is a place with a cultural programming about civil rights, about human rights, about urban design, about architecture. And so if we don't have this program here, and in fact, if we did not come to this building, or this building was vacant, let's say, I would argue that it is completely irrelevant. What would even be the purpose of having a building, but for us and programs? And or if we're creating something for another type of program, like a zoo or something. I do think, though, that while we provide a relevance to the built environment, to these spaces and places, there is an exchange. And when we're here, we have our own image and identity informed. And so it is a nice symbiotic relationship. How did I get into civil sites? How did I, think about this? This is a quick personal history. I'm from New Orleans. Growing up there, I like to say I grew up in the gumbo that is New Orleans. I mean, the whole thing was mixed up, between fried shrimp and parades and music and art and oak trees with Spanish moss. And I was really fortunate to be raised in a family where our parents, myself and my younger sister, were exposed to so much of this. And so I believe that who we are as kids is who we are as adults. I didn't realize that I was a historic preservationist in those terms growing up. And some of you who may have come to other talks would likely have heard me say this. I was out on an adventure one day and I came across a puddle. And in the middle of that puddle was a frog. And I was like, oh, cool, a frog in a puddle. I'm like a young kid. And then I realized that the puddle was full of oil. And I thought to myself, that is not good. That's not right. This frog is alive. Now, I didn't think about this in terms of environmental sustainability or the preservation of the frog's life. I just knew it wasn't good. I've always been a preservationist. I've also always been a writer. I started out doing things like little cartoon strips. Now the primary medium for sharing the stories is the built environment. So the spaces and places, because they do tell stories. And we're going to get to that in pretty good depth. I love that, by the way. I also am an entrepreneur. And I was kind of the kid that was wholesaling lemons and sugar to the lemonade stands. I was like in it early. So that's a quick personal like history. All of that comes together for civil sites because I was a lover of stories. I was paying attention and I saw the tornado of 2008 rip through Atlanta. So if you were here, you remember it. And what I didn't see that night was what it did on Auburn Avenue. This tornado carved a 6-mile path from the CNN Center down Auburn Avenue to Oakland Cemetery, destruction at a price tag of about $250 million in those days, loss of life, and destruction to buildings, including ripping the roof off of the Daily World building, home to the oldest Black newspaper in U.S. history, home to District 5, Atlanta's first Black Girl Scout troops, home to Virgil Coffee Company in 1918. Just incredible people doing remarkable and impactful things over this course of history. About 2 years after that building was struck by the tornado, which had ripped the roof off of it, and insurance did not provide enough money to put one back, so there was just a tarp. It rained in there for 2 years. The building looked like it had been hit by a tornado, frankly. And a developer applied for a demolition permit to tear it down. And this is when I really started paying attention because 1,100 people from the community got together and signed a petition to deny that demo permit. I mean, how often are we seeing 1,100 people come together to do anything in unison today? You know, and this was a big story. So I started paying attention. But it wasn't until about a year later when I met Alexa Scott, whose grandfather started the paper on Auburn Avenue. She wanted to bring the paper, the Atlanta Daily World, back to Auburn. And she couldn't go back to that building. And I asked her, what are you doing with this building? And she's like, well, it's just kind of there. And I said, would you and your family sell it to me and our firm with the promise of doing a historic preservation that honored the legacy, honors the people, honors the history, and honors really the future? And she said that she would, and we were able to do that. In studying that building's history, I became acutely aware of how rich and impactful it was. And then I realized this history is not exclusive to just one building on Auburn Avenue. It's exclusive to this entire district. That's when I really got kind of hooked on civil rights history and Sweet Auburn history, and ultimately wrote this book, which only took me about 8 years. I am a slow reader, but also I don't really think in hindsight that I was ready to write the book until about midway through the 5th year. I had not lived enough, I had not spent enough time in Sweet Auburn, despite doing real estate there before. And I had not gone to Georgia Tech yet. I mean, we learn how to research here. We learn how to think critically. We have great mentors. One of mine is sitting in the audience. We make great friends. One of them is sitting in the audience. We meet other, colleagues. That's happening here too. So midway through the 5th year, I got pretty serious. If you're writing a book, don't do what I did and start without a table of contents. Try getting that and an outline together and then get an editor. I do want to give some praise to Trevor Williams, who is the editor at Global Atlanta and also the editor of this book. Also, and this will come up throughout the conversation, I need to give really great praise and gratitude to Dr. Royster. Jackie is the cultural editor of the book. I don't believe that I could responsibly write a book about Sweet Auburn without perspectives that there's no way that I will ever have. I'm not a woman. I am not Black. I was not born in a segregated South. I did not spend time on the east side and west side of Atlanta. I'm not a rhetorical scholar. I haven't been the dean of 2 colleges, and thank you, Jackie, for making this book much, much greater than it could have been alone. Sweet Auburn, we've already kind of covered this in the introduction, birthplace of the civil rights movement, and Dr. King. I usually put Dr. King in here because it's a quick way to understand relevance on an international level. But I want to just start out really early by saying it did not take me very long in my research to realize the exclusionary nature of history. And this is a well-educated audience and people who care and don't have a show of hands, but I would be willing to bet that not many people in here can name more than 3 women in the civil rights movement. I know that I couldn't before I started this research. And there are just so many women, and in particular, Black women and women of color who contributed to the success of civil and human rights on behalf of us all. And when I really started to realize that and understand that and the value of that inclusion, that's when the focus of this book shifted to really be about unsung, unknown, underrepresented heroes and heroines of the movement. These were people who were involved with faith, with education. They were leaders in the arts and everyone really in service to others. So I did take the theories of urban design class. And I like to kind of half kid that it took me 20 minutes just to read the syllabus. You assign so much reading and it hurts so good. And I consider it a great inheritance. And that's kind of the nod to the Leon Creer sketch about forms of accumulations. One of the many lessons that I learned, in this case, saw instead of read, about what is really important. Is it a big pile of gold coins? Or is it, churches and schools and parks and places where we can come together and commune? And so I really like that as a starting point. Ellen sent me a note about today. How did the neighborhood of Dr. King's childhood shape his views in the larger civil rights movement? That's the question. How did today's efforts at cultural and historic preservation inspire social change? I think that we're going to learn a lot by leaning in on this storied past through stories and discuss historical memory. So, how we understand, how we preserve and share history in this pervasive way, which we'll get to create cultural narratives that help us shape and interpret the world around us. The introduction mission of the guide. I'm not going to do a whole lot of reading from the book. I hope that you all will dive in, at some point, but I do think it's important to start where this really started. So this is from the introduction, mission of the guide. In 1854, less than a decade before the onset of the American Civil War, a free Black woman named Laura Lavinia Kelly Combs purchased a small lot at the intersection of Whitehall Street, now Peachtree, and Wheat Street, now Auburn Avenue. With this visionary acquisition, Combs became the first Black person to own property in Sweet Auburn, a district later recognized as the primary nexus of Black culture and commerce in the United States, despite extreme challenges in the face of institutionalized segregation. In a move foreshadowing the neighborhood's ethos of empowerment, Holmes soon directed her investment toward a profound and deeply personal mission, exchanging that land for something of far greater value, her husband's freedom from slavery. That is about courage. That is about leadership. That is about faith. And that leads us to another cornerstone of Sweet Auburn, the church. I was not raised in a church. I guess unless you consider New Orleans a church, which then I was. But I was not raised in the church. Trevor Williams, the editor, and Jackie, both raised in the church. I learned a lot. And this section on Big Bethel is one of my favorites because it talks about leadership. It references two women that basically no one's ever heard of. And Big Bethel and what these women in this congregation were able to do was a huge turning point in the right direction for what was possible in Sweet Auburn. So, hailed as Sweet Auburn City Hall, the church served as a nexus for social action, community organizing, and educational outreach. Gate City Colored School, established in the basement in 1879, was one of a handful of early schools providing free education to Black students in the city. Similarly, the AME Church's Morris Brown College, the first college in Georgia organized solely by Black people, began holding classes in Big Bethel's basement in 1881 and stayed there until the school's first permanent campus opened 4 years later. Big Bethel's membership swelled after the Great Fire of 1917 destroyed all of the Fourth Ward's other Black churches. Ironically, the same force that helped propel the church nearly destroyed it just a few years later. In 1923, an inferno engulfed the newly renovated sanctuary just one day after its insurance policy had lapsed. With the church forced to rebuild, Black architect J.A. Langford offered a new vision and destiny with a Romanesque revival design that reflected the church's Victorian roots. A signature steeple and pipe organ were added during Reconstruction. Resurrecting the congregation's spiritual home required faith and perseverance in the face of financial hardship. Lula B. Jones and Nellie L. Davis, who sang in the church choir and taught at Sunday school, sought to raise funds by selling tickets to a play they wrote that was accompanied by spirituals and hymns. Their prayers were answered several times over. Heaven Bound debuted at Big Bethel on February 17, 1930, and went on to enjoy overwhelming success both at home and on tour, where it had been performed before more than 1 million people by the early 1970s. So this is another story about courage, about leadership, about coming together in community, about trying to do something for the greater good. And Big Bethel would become the venue for voter registration. I can't get into every detail because we just don't have enough time, but 20,000 Blacks were added to the voter rolls. This number started to really make a difference when it came to political sway and the ability to get the attention and action of politicians that started slowly but surely to change laws. If this church isn't rebuilt, you might not have this happening at least at the same time, or maybe it would have happened in a different way. And there was, it's like life. I mean, if this, but that, this was just a major one. And I wanted to make sure to pay homage to these women and this congregation. Education. So I think we can all agree that education is important. The Charles Lincoln Harper House is a place where a remarkable educator spent time with family in Sweet Auburn. And I just want to quickly I'm not even going to read this. I'll just say that Charles Lincoln Harper eventually became the principal at Booker T. Washington High School. Before that school, though, education for Blacks in Atlanta only went through the 5th grade. So imagine people who just could not legally get education in going into middle school. And Charles Lincoln Harper dedicated his life to making a difference by making sure people could get educated. If you go back to the Civil War, right, fought over slavery or commerce, fear, other things. If you don't have the Civil War, you don't have a negotiated peace. If you don't have a negotiated peace, you really likely aren't getting to Reconstruction, which had promises that were unfulfilled. If you don't have Reconstruction, you don't have organizations like the Southern Education Foundation, which was formed in 1865 to educate poor kids in the South with $1 million Peabody grant at the time. And you end up not having a educated group of people who could come together and then build churches and raise money and get people voting and going to college. You don't have college students. You don't have the Atlanta student movement. These are like really foundational to where we are in a good way in the world today. And so I just think that focusing on these people, the historical memory that can come from their action when we're walking down Sweet Auburn and we look at this house and we try to understand where are we today by understanding where we've come from. And then when we understand where we are today, then we have a much better chance at getting to where we want to go in the future. I've already mentioned a tornado. I've already mentioned a fire. There's wrecking balls. There's demolition via neglect. There's all kinds of forces out there that are working against this conspicuous evidence of, spaces and places and mediums that have the ability to share these stories. So I am very interested in preservation. Again, in a pervasive way. I would say that Civil Sites is an example of preservation by working hard and collaborating and spending 8 years writing this to be able to share it so that hopefully people can go and have their own experience, have their own viewpoint. And that brings up the birth home. So this is a very, very short profile in the book, and I think it could be worth reading because it's fun. All right. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born at noon on Tuesday, January 15th, 1929, in an upstairs bedroom in this 1895 Queen Anne style two-story home. Michael Jr., as he was known in those days, lived the first 12 years of his life here before the family moved to a now demolished home a few blocks away at 193 Boulevard. For the young MLK Jr., the birth home and the surrounding neighborhood were simply the backdrop of his childhood, a place to play hide and seek, to study, and to get into mischief. Originally built for a white family, the home was bought in 1909 by King's maternal grandfather, the Reverend Adam Daniel Williams, the second pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. The third pastor was Martin Luther King Jr.'s father, Daddy King, who took up the post in 1931 and whose ministry brought many activists and organizers into the family home. Walking between home and church, MLK Jr. encountered Black Atlantans of many different social classes. Seeing economic hardship and disparities up close sowed seeds that King later cultivated into a holistic worldview that insisted that true equality necessarily included economic empowerment. And so I mentioned views. These are perspectives. These are vistas. These are glimpses into a future. I would say that we all are moving from home of some sense. It could be within us. It could be our physical homes. It could be a campus. It could be another country. And we're going to places of faith or worship. And I'm using this in an abstracted manner. We all have the chance to see what is around us, to see who is around us, to consider them, to get to know them. And that's how we'll sow the seeds for our own worldviews and make our own positive difference in the world. The arts, one, I just love the arts. But in the words of Congressman Lewis, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings, without the arts. And being in commercial real estate, again, with this cultural focus, incredibly fortunate and honored to be able to collaborate with Congressman Lewis and his staff when he decided to put his reelection campaign headquarters on Auburn Avenue. It was their idea to create the John Lewis Here mural. Why would Congressman Lewis want to put a 70-foot mural on Auburn Avenue? He was a pretty humble person, especially given his leadership stature. I believe that he put it on Auburn Avenue because he wanted people to know this place is important and we're going to make it big. And myself and our team happen to be in a fortunate position of leadership of our own to help make this possible. I think that it is working. It is now obscured from the interstate because of new development or progress. Can't help that. But it's still there and it is being captured all the time on our phones, right? This is just another way or another medium. Remember, I studied digital media here. It is another way to connect. It is another way to preserve and another way to share a legacy, but also to share a vision for what is possible. And so about preservation, I would like to invite you all and encourage you all to help our history have a future, to do what you do. That could be through writing a play. It could be public art for public good. It could be having a lecture series. These are all different ways for us to connect history to the present day for the future. I mentioned the Daily World building. So many incredible people. I'll focus quickly on District 5. District 5, Atlanta's first Black Girl Scout troop, they were started the year before, right? So 1943. The Girl Scouts were founded in 1912 in Savannah. It took a while for Georgia to get our first Black Scouts. They were in this building the year after their founding here. These are people who really did change the world for the better that I did not know exist. And I am so glad that I do now. One, Madeline Nix, part of the Atlanta Nine, who helped desegregate Atlanta public schools. Another, Rosalind Pope. Rosalind Pope was a senior at Spelman, my second favorite college. I have great admiration for Spelman. When she was a senior at Spelman, she became the principal author of an appeal for human rights, a civil rights manifesto that called for equality in total, in every way. This manifesto helped spark the Atlanta student movement. It helped spark the national student movement. It gave firepower to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And the Girl Scouts wanted to honor District 5 and the accomplishments that its scouts helped pave the way for by doing a mural. This is the building after the tornado. This is what it looks like now. This is the District 5 honor mural. The Girl Scouts, and in particular, a woman named Leslie Gilliam, called City of Atlanta Cultural Affairs and said, we want to do a mural to honor District 5. Do you know anyone who can help us find a wall? And because we had been involved with the John Lewis Hero mural, Leslie was introduced to me and we spoke, and she said, can you help us find a wall? And I was like, I think I've got a good one. It's the wall that was on the building you all were in. And so Helen McGoy, who's pictured here with me, a Girl Scout, a Gold Award Scout, led this project with the Girl Scouts, and a woman named Emily Cadena, who flew in from New York, she's also a Girl Scout, to work alongside Loss Prevention, the mural team who also did the John Lewis Hero mural, and were able to create this. This is, again, an example of a pervasive form of preservation, where you can use your talent as an artist or your interest as an organization to help share a story, because not everyone is going to just stop by, frankly, like a random building in a city that they might be visiting for 12 hours and just start looking up the history. And not everyone's going to pick up this book and spend the time reading it. But if you're one of these almost 700,000 people a year who come to visit the King Center, and you see this and you just happen to be a Girl Scout, or you happen to like the color orange or yellow or pink, and you decide to Google this, you're going to learn about Rosalind Pope and District 5. And you are going to learn about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And you're going to learn about Ella Baker and so many more. And so this is just fun for me. Hopefully it's becoming pretty evident how all of this is additive. It's just one step at a time. And I have to tell this story. And Jackie, please bear with me because you've heard it. You said it. One day I was on the phone with Jackie, and she said, how are you doing, kid? And I said, not well. And she goes, what's going on? I'm like, I am completely overwhelmed here in this research. There is just too much history. There are too many people. I cannot do it all. And you said, Gene, it's just one little book. And that was so liberating to me. It was such great mentoring. And, you know, we can only focus on what we can focus on. But, you know, if we do it with passion, like Ellen, you do with your class, like you do with this series, like I am quite sure all of you do in your own way, then we can really make a positive difference in the world. Thank you so much, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Gene. Oh my gosh. All right. I want to invite Bill and Jackie and Clay and Gene to take a seat. Gene, really, your depth of the site histories, I just hope every architecture student, every architect sort of feels a little bit of a shiver of like, oh boy, I never did site analysis like that. Oh my gosh, there's so much.
Well,
You've set a bar that is fabulous.
Thank you. Doing site analysis is one thing. Getting the chance to work with Clay Kiningham is a whole other.
Yeah.
I'm reserving that for this, but you know, Clay, you through your work bring life to those pages and well beyond, and I'm grateful.
Well, you know, it's funny. You should do that. The first question I wanted to pose was to Clay. So, Clay, most guidebooks show photos, not drawings. Most histories rely on photos or sometimes illustrations, but it's when the buildings were new. I have my own reasons for loving your sketches, but I'd like to hear you tell the audience why you thought that hand-drawn sketches of their condition today, mostly as seen from the street, including a few passersby, as well as sometimes the sketches are of details. But why did you feel that was the right way to engage readers, to tell stories?
Well, I think photos are great. They extract all details in an instant. Sketches are a little different. There's really, from the architecture point of view, you can say there's three different types of drawings. There's the definitive drawing, like plans and construction documents. Then there's design drawings where you're really thinking through a design and communicating that to others. And then there's the referential sketch, which is really about studying what's already there and understanding it. And that can become a notebook or sketchbook for referencing and understanding the past. And the way it's different from photos is you can take a photo and come back to it later and see every detail. But a referential sketch pinpoints the details that are most important. And in a way, it distills all the information so that you can understand in a different way. And I think another aspect of sketches is they're just kind of wiggly and loose and not always totally accurate, which causes people to look twice at the buildings that they represent.
Wow. Thank you. Your drawings are extremely eloquent. Jackie, your words are always extremely eloquent. Your winning rhetoric. So Jackie wrote the afterword in the book, which beautifully describes how you, as a young girl from a small town, felt, I quote, affirmed by this richly endowed ecosystem during your frequent visits to see your aunts and cousins in Sweet Auburn and the Old Fourth Ward neighborhood. Drawing on your early experience, as well as your later research into activists and kind of what makes an activist become an activist, do you agree with Gene's thesis that growing up, or implied thesis, I mean, none of us are really trying to speak for the Reverend, but that growing up in Sweet Auburn's tightly woven ecosystem similarly affirmed Martin Luther King's sense of self-worth, mission, and pursuit of the beloved community?
I can be really basic, of course. But one of the things to emphasize about Sweet Auburn and community as a human construct is that people come together to build communities to take care of the things that they need to take care of. That was just as true for the Old Fourth Ward Sweet Auburn community as anywhere else. And the thing that is just so remarkable about that one was that they were so doggone good at it. They brought together, given the resources that were available in this urban environment, all sorts of relationships, all sorts of resources that provided for the people who did not have to set foot out of that area if they didn't want to satisfy their needs. And so having that ecosystem around you certainly conveys to any person growing up within it what possibilities are and what disconnects are. And so someone like King or me, you develop an eye for what you see, what you don't see, and what should and could be there instead. And I think his life is a testimony to those relationships.
Thank you. Yeah. All right, Bill, you are, I believe, fourth generation Atlantan. Am I right?
At least.
At least. Okay. You have family who lived in Sweet Auburn, and you're a self-described activist architect. When you started raising hell. That's a good thing to do. All right. Now, and I want to actually just pause for just a second because are we picking up your mic fully? I'm not sure we're getting your voice, Bill.
No.
Okay.
Okay, good. So please continue.
Bill, you and iVenue designed the most iconic new building in the neighborhood in the 1990s. Tell us a bit about how you approached designing the Horizon Sanctuary right across the street from Ebenezer Baptist and holding the congregation there in such an incredibly rich context and as an activist architect.
Well, first of all, my father was born in 1900 on Auburn Avenue for all intents and purposes. My grandparents came from Sparta, Georgia, with Charles Lincoln Harper High School. Charles Lincoln Harper, whose son was our family doctor, one of them, in the early part of 1890s, okay? And both taught at Morris Brown College in a normal school. It wasn't a high school. And so to make up for students not being able to go to high school, there were lab schools in virtually every Black university and college around the country. And certain kids were sent off to go to school, and certain people came to live with families so that they could go to school and eventually go to college. And these lab schools turned into colleges in many places. So I had the fortune of being born in the right place at the right time with the right people. And having had experiences up and down Auburn Avenue, good and bad, because I was a badass. I believe in hanging out late at night at the Auburn Avenue Casino, not the Royal Peacock, because people knew me over there, or at the 81 Theater and other places, because that was where the fun was. In fact, I used to recruit football players for Georgia Tech and take them straight down Auburn Avenue where they could have a good time. I actually lost a student one time. And we found him next Sunday. They said, I told Coach, I said, you don't want this boy. He fell in love, basically, and found himself in somebody's arms for the rest of the weekend. But being on Auburn Avenue was special. You saw a picture of my dad in 1919. We want to flash that again. And so we sort of took it for granted that this was a grand place. It was just as good as Harlem was on 25th Street, where my cousins lived. We had everything we needed to have, both there and on Hunter Street, on the west side of town. We only went to shop downtown for Easter. The rest of the time, we got our culture at Spelman College, which is where the AMS players would perform on an ongoing basis. We had musicals. I remember going to Bethel for Heaven Bound. The man who played the devil in Heaven Bound was my elementary school teacher's husband, Lorraine Furlow. And she was also an AME and was a part of this whole group. And I remember that my aunt was very actively involved in the churches in and about Auburn Avenue. So they would get together on Sunday afternoon and talk about who preached what and how good he was or who didn't follow the script, because my other aunt was writing speeches for Daddy King, writing sermons for him, which was common, My high school teacher wrote sermons for other preachers as well. My two brothers-in-laws who are now passed on refused to have anybody write write sermons for them. But that's just the way that these things happen in these churches. And so because I had the relationships in and about churches, there was a trust factor that said this young man can design the building. Now, there were others who wanted to see somebody from New York to come and do the building. And there was a competition of some other highbrow architects from around. And Joe Roberts just said, I think I'm going to try with him. And Howard Spiller was another person who had a deacon board. He said, Bill will look you in the eye. He will make it happen for you. John Lewis's chief of staff was my wife's best friend. So that didn't hurt. But one of the other things that we found out was that we designed a Gothic church directly adjacent to the existing building. and found we were going to take out the administrative building. They said, oh, no, you can't touch that building because it's on the National Historic Registry. And that's where Martin King had his last birthday party. I said, what? No, you got to go across. You got to go somewhere else into this building. So take that set of drawings and models and put it in a box and think again. So we looked across the street and found the place. And we had to have a land swap between the government of Atlanta and the federal government so that they could take a library that they had a daycare center and loan it to the church. The church then loaned, had an agreement with the federal government that they could interpret the old sanctuary, and we could then build what we needed to build on that site. And so when you look at the building where it's oriented, you'll see that there's an axis that parallels Jackson Street, but there's another that goes straight through the head of Dr. King in the crypt. We felt it was very important that we do that. We get the orientation correct, that we understand the architectonics of the building. So we took some of the Gothic elements from this building and made it Afrocentric over on this side, because it was something that really made a lot of sense for us to go back to the old ways of incantation and dance, the way we worship in churches, what we do that is different from other churches. You mentioned New Orleans. Well, part of your experience down there is because people jump up and down, they dance, they run around in circles, they have a good time in church without experiencing religiosity, but in real serious contemplation of what this word means to us on this day. We've been working and catching hell all week long. We could at least be free. And so building that church, I've done some others, was very important, I think, in terms of our context. And it took us, 12 years to do it because we had some joints together. We did the first group, that was 4 years, and then we got the land swap and right. And then we got the building designed and ready to go out, and oops, the Olympics comes. And so I just told me that we were somewhere next door in an Olympic, Georgia Tech Olympic exhibit there. But all the prices went out of the roof. I mean, you can't buy anything, you can't build anything, you can't move on Auburn Avenue during this time period. So the church had to wait again. But Joe Roberts was a wonderful man who did not start off as a Baptist preacher. He was really an AME preacher. So he and I kind of understood each other. And his father was an AME. And we hung in there with him. We didn't get paid for a long time because we needed to give that work time to sink in, and all the gymnastics of dealing with the federal government, dealing with the powers that be in Atlanta. And there's some serious powers that be in Atlanta when you're a young architect trying to break through. And so we prevailed and got the building to say what it needed to say, have thatching. I was a student architect in Ireland when I really learned what thatching was all about a year in 1969. And so we wanted the roof to look like thatching. So we got a copper roof. And we wanted the brick to look like the church across the street for context. And we wanted to have the grasses of the savannas in the carpet. And so we took that theme and took it all the way in. And we then said, this is a celebration. This makes sense for us. And that's why I think the building got the notoriety that it did, because it was not predictable, but it was something that would be memorable. And Raphael loves it, being in there. When he came in, he said, I want you to do this and that's one. Raphael, you can do a little bit of this, but some of that doesn't work. And so they convinced him. That's I'm talking about Raphael Warnock now. And so we've worked with everybody who's been involved in that church over the years because it was very important, very special. Because it was Mike King's church. And I call him Mike King because that's what my folks called him. That was his name before his father changed his name to Martin Luther once he went to Germany. And so the familiarity for us with the Avenue and the things that happened on the Avenue, the relationships we had with Big Bethel and other people was very special and very important. And so my uncle practiced architecture right across from Big Bethel. Practiced medicine, across the street. My grandmother died in 1911. She was teaching at Marsh Brown College, which is a normal school at that time. And her other uncle went out west to teach in Prairie View. So this whole notion of being a part of a group of people that were making things happen in Atlanta was not foreign. We just knew that things needed to be done, and we needed to be bold enough to do them, wherever that was. And so I ended up here at Georgia Tech doing things that were kind of off the wall, like being a founder of the Georgia Tech Afro-American Association and working on through with NOMAC and some other things. So that's a long version of what the church meant to us, but it's the experience, necessarily the architectonics that made it happen.
Thank you, Bill. Really, I mean, this gets now, I think, really into the discussion of cultural preservation as well as cultural continuity and how those two do or don't kind of come together. Jackie, in your afterword, you also described how, as a college student at the Atlanta University Center, Spelman, I assume, you felt deep sadness seeing how in the 70s, 80s, 1970s, 80s, Sweet Auburn was in decline, both due to the interstate coming through, abandonment, and nowadays gentrification. But you also, in the afterward, you described the new and continuing kind of sturdy anchors, or what some of us call social infrastructure, that has some of which continued, but also the new ones that come in. Can you share with the audience what some of those are and why they are so important?
Well, I think your question really gets back to what Bill was saying underneath all of the information shared about the evolution of the new Horizon building. Sweet Auburn is about the people of Sweet Auburn and what they were able to do with whatever they found to do it with. And so as a child, I grew up not in Atlanta, in a small town, not too far from Sparta, by the way, in a small town, but I spent a lot of time here just within that system and taking in what people were able to do despite the oppressive conditions within which they were required to do it. They found ways to get joy. They found ways to deliver what their community needed to have delivered. They used their resources very well. And you come up with Auburn Avenue as a Sweet Auburn kind of concept. Well, by the time I got to college, I was then haunted by the memories of what it meant to grow up within that environment. I knew what it looked like. So when I was riding up and down Auburn Avenue, I was haunted by what was then that was disintegrating before my eyes, starting then. And that only got worse because of various kinds of disinvestments and ongoing oppression, discrimination, choose your own words for how a community can appear to be in decline. But what I like to underscore is that the people were still there. They were still fighting. Things had spread out. I mean, my family was an East Side and a West Side family. We lived all over the city. But there was still the heart of Auburn Avenue. So it didn't die. It had to do something different. And what I find affirming now is that people have found ways to do that something different, to keep the spirit of the people that produced the original community alive, vibrant, and ever evolving. And so when you talk about the social structures, there are different kind of structures. I mean, the library is there. It's one of my structures because I'm an archival researcher. So I love the Auburn Avenue Library. I think it is wonderful to have such a distinctive resource in that community. There are arts organizations, there are tea companies, there are business people there. There are all kinds of things there now that are contributing to the ongoing vibrancy of the people who have called that home. But when I ride through Auburn Avenue today, I still get haunted by what used to be when I was a little girl.
So, Gene, you're helping to bring back some of those, revive the ghosts, or bring new life, certainly, to many of the buildings that became a bit ghostly. And much of the value of historic preservation is the role it plays in cultural preservation. But while you and the artists are certainly keeping the achievements of the past in Sweet Auburn alive, in what ways do you feel you're able to really continue the culture of activism and working towards social change? It's not usually on the job description of preservationist or developer, but what do you think is possible, and what would you like to see other people be doing in terms of really being activists about social change?
Well, that is a important and deep question. I do want to just quickly mention that I am proud of the work. Read the afterword. It is exceptional. It is moving. It is the part of the book that brought me both the greatest contemporary inspiration and tears. And so I think that pick your form of activism. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an activist. I'm doing things that bring me joy and that hopefully I can help others connect with, primarily through sharing stories, which can be shared in the form of beautiful sketches.
Thinking about the murals and just literally, re-inhabiting the buildings, restoring and preserving the buildings.
Yeah, I mean, that is part of that story. Like, we have our own personal connections, but you have to have a contemporary program. As a preservationist, I think preservation for the sake of preservation, you might end up with a relic. And if you don't have a contemporary program, you're not going to have funding to continue to see that place play a part in an active community. And, with Clay, the sketches, it was really wonderful. Me and Clay met online. I was here at Georgia Tech. I also had a company at this point in time. I'm trying to get through a master's program and I needed a break. And so I was just like scrolling on Instagram and I saw this beautiful artwork. That prompted me to send you a message. Where are you? I'm in Atlanta. Where? I go to Georgia Tech. I'm at Georgia Tech. Next thing you know, we're having coffee at Starbucks. And literally within the first coffee, we decided to collaborate together. Later, I picked up the book, Here's New York, which I recommend putting on your list for students. So E.B. White, right? Charlotte's Web. And it is about New York at its moment in time before kind of everything changed. Like, there are, I'll call them scenes in the book, where he walks into a restaurant and sees a TV in a restaurant for the first time. And I think that, it's only 48 pages, but it is the type of thing that kind of cements or locks in a moment in time in a very picturesque manner. That's what I think Clay's work really does. I'm more writing about the history, right? But the sketches are, I think, our report card for the future. We're going to look back in 20 years or whatever, and I hope that you're not more haunted. I hope that we all are contributing or being active or, activists in our own way to try to not only like protect and conserve, which is preservation, but to make active these spaces so more people can enjoy them and start their own stories.
I think that we need to do in conversations like this is think about what activism really means, what preservation really means. You're not just talking about going out and blowing stuff up. It's not just beating people up. It's not just tearing things down. It's having a sense of wanting to do something to make the world a better place, for example, and to use your talents, whatever they are, to think about what can I do to make something better than the way that I found it. And it doesn't have to be huge. It can be very small. It doesn't have to be everything over a whole lifetime, as some people are dedicated to, but it can be whatever it is that you can do. And so spending the time to think about what is an active life, what is a life that allows you to dedicate yourself to the good of your community, to the healthiness of your community, whether you're talking about a building or you're talking about the children in it with dedication to education, or whatever it is that you're talking about. And so spending the time to think about, and this is the rhetorical person in me. This is what we do in rhetorical. So think about the terms that you're using and why you're using them, because they do help you to understand what it is that you're trying to see, what it is you're trying to do, and what impact you're trying to have by doing that. So you can see activism in a wonderful drawing. You can see activism in a commitment to buy a building that was going to be torn down. You can see activism in whatever it is that you're doing. And you can see that sense of community that says to you, I'm going to design this building, but it's going to be an African-centered building because I know this community and the kinds of things that they care about.
For me, activism in a real sense in architecture, it's building, it's designing and making it happen. And the tip of the spear, as far as I'm concerned, with Auburn Avenue starts with Mr. Herndon. I was the chairman of the Herndon Foundation for about 10 years and was the vice president of Atlanta Life Insurance Corporation. And it was voted down when I said, we don't need to sell this building to Georgia State and this edifice for any Black company in the country, perhaps in the world. You can talk about Johnson Wax, or Johnson Public Relations in Chicago, designed by Matumime, I'm sorry, who is Arthur Ashe's father-in-law. Or you can talk about the joint venture between J.W. Robinson and Thompson Mitchell and Steinbeck, and creating this space right here, this big space on Auburn Avenue, which contributed to everything else around it by preserving the Auburn Avenue buildings, his first buildings, and the ones down on the other end of the avenue, and then what happens beyond there. So, and First Congregational Church, which was his church, which we designed another part for in addition to. So the movers and the shakers sometimes are the people who are quietly moving things along. I mean, he couldn't, with 4 months of it, 6 months of formal education, he then funded the Niagara movement. W.B. Du Bois is a good friend of his. In fact, Du Bois' house was right next to ours, behind ours, at Atlanta University Center where we started out. So you could see these people, you could understand what they were talking about, why they were talking about what they were talking about. And so this kind of history, this kind of formative history that really talks about everything in the diaspora that we need to be involved with, starts with the juxtaposition of a man with a pair of scissors who comes in and decides long after the woman bought the property on Peach Street and bought a building on Peach Street and then bought another building on Auburn Avenue and then bought some more and built some more. It was a land developer and literally built the entire west side of Atlanta University, Beaver Slide, and Vine City, because he was so brilliant and forward thinking. And so the preservation for us is not only for Auburn Avenue, but for everything else that he did. His mansion, which I bet you and I did a master plan and a renovation of in 2015, I'm sorry, which is in somewhat of a disrepair right now because the company was bought by Magic Johnson. He now owns that and the art collection around it. And I don't mean to just grab the whole conversation about a bond, but when you start thinking about activism, it takes many, many forms. It's being political. It's being practical. It's talking to financiers, talking to developers, talking to bankers, talking to the mayor, talking to the governor, and anybody else you can talk to about something that you care deeply about, that is your history, your heritage, that it must stay. And I'm disappointed right now because the cigar stand with a little wooden Indian outside is no longer on Auburn Avenue. I used to go there and smoke cigars and bring my own liquor in, my own cognac, and pay him a penny fee.
Add to that, because like what we have been talking about also requires loss. And I mentioned I'm a preservationist, but I didn't have any real clue until Hurricane Katrina. And when that destroyed my home, when I say home, I mean city, you pretty quickly realize that, without the people, what is the point of these buildings? And when you have this type of displacement on par with World War II Europe in your city, you realize what Jackie and Bill are talking about, not in the same way. I will never know it like you all know it, but I have experienced that loss. And, there has to be something that is strong enough to motivate us to take the action,
But being a designer, being an architect, being a cultural preservationist, being whatever kind of community activist you choose to be, means developing the vision to connect more dots than your own. And the way in which you pull it together and try to come up with something that is honorable and has some integrity. All of that is what we're talking about here. So if you talk to me, you're going to get a humanist perspective, but I know about the built environment a little bit too. If you talk to other people, then you get a different perspective. And to me, what is most culturally relevant about that is that people of African descent historically have been cooperative, collaborative, strategic in solving its problems, which means that we're willing to work together with others to make something beautiful and more than what was there to begin with.
Because frequently the people who bring the money are looking for the culture. They need it for their own
Good point. But I am at this
We're just jumping all over your questions that you sent us,
I actually want to invite Hassan Allen and Akram Ahmed to come to the podium because they are going to moderate Q&A from the audience. So last reminder, please put questions onto Slido and enter code 3524196. And I'll introduce Hassan is president and Akram is vice president of the Georgia Tech chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students. Welcome, Hassan and Akram.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you, Gene. This was a wonderful lecture. Thank you for presenting. The first question we have is, you opened the book up with a very powerful and emotional story. What did you want readers to feel in those pages, and does that shape the rest of the book?
Well, it's about a system of values. It's what is important? Is it like having some real estate and making a profit? Or is it selling that real estate to have something of a far greater value? A loved one, like a human life. And it's just absolute courage. So I thought it was a good way to open the book. And it was also one of those things that when I read it, I was moved, sad. And also not like angry, but really motivated to work harder.
All right.
And so building off of that question, Gene, you spoke earlier about not starting with the table of contents in your approach to creating the book. What research kind of anchored your approach? Like, can you talk a little bit about that approach to making the book?
Yes. Well, I will say, if at all possible, start a book by working with clay because it's going to be incredible. I just am a late bloomer. I didn't go to grad school till I was 40. I'll be 53 this week. I don't know if I would do it the same way, but I don't regret the way that this came about. I also got a lot of encouragement along the way from growing up. Also here, when Jackie was the dean of the Ivan Allen College, I was a student. We've heard about like the importance of going in and meeting other people. I do not think, by the way, that you can build community. I think we give people like spaces, places, what they want and need, and then they come together and build community. And Georgia Tech is a great place for this. I mean, everyone in this room has the ability to go and talk to someone, meet someone else. Had I not met Trevor Williams, it could have been another 8 years before the book was finished. Like, he's like, "You don't have a table of contents?" And I said, "No." And so, I got a lot of help in this book.
Well, as a writing teacher, I do want to say that tables of contents are places to start, as long as you think of them as ever-evolving touchstones for the kind of thing that you're going to continue to do. But what is more important underneath that advice, I believe, is don't minimize your inspiration. It can come from so many different places, from so many different people, in so many different kinds of conversations. And you have to be reflective about that. And so having a touchstone like a table of contents is good to give you a springboard for thinking about who you are, what you're trying to do, what you want to do. And this is the rhetorician again, knowing what words might work and conveying that spirit and that choice.
Speaking of Clay, the artwork was amazing. The sketches were really powerful. How closely did you and Gene work together? Were the sketches responding to his storytelling, or did the visuals sometimes lead to the storytelling?
It was back and forth. I think it started off, I think most books with illustrations, the book is more or less written and the illustrations come second. But Gene gave me a list and I went out and started sketching buildings, and then Gene would write about the buildings. And then as he would write, he would ask me to draw more buildings, and then it was just back and forth. And then there was a lot of redoing sketches too. Gene is, I learned a lot from Gene, and I don't know, it was a really iterative process, and kind of started with sketches, but really it started with the idea of the book.
I would say that, yes, there were some sketches that were redone, but the majority of the ones that were redone, I saw a sketch that I thought was expert. And then without saying anything, months later, Clay would just hand me a revised version of the sketch. I'm like, it was already incredible. So, you were self-starting quite a bit too.
But those visualizations help both of them to think about what they were trying to do. So the iterative process that you're talking about, how does a visualization help you to see what you had not noticed before? How does it help you to represent the idea that you want to convey? And the thing about civil sites is that the marriage of the visualizations and the words, the stories, is remarkable.
There's a tremendous backdrop of information that's already available. I don't know if you saw the Habs drawings. The Habs drawings, which were created by Tuskegee students on the weekends and in summers, funded by the National Park Service. They very carefully detailed and drew every building on Auburn Avenue, every one of them. And we used them in context as a part of the context for deciding what should happen with the original Ebenezer Baptist Church and what should happen with other buildings. And so that context exists. It was very carefully done according to federal standards. And then, so having it viewed through a different set of lens is quite interesting. because it's always been there. Fortunately, if you wanted to recreate it or go back and rebuild Auburn Avenue, at least from a facade standpoint, you could, because that work is there. And I'm so happy that they were able to find the funding and the impetus to do that early on in the process.
And I would say too, with these sketches in particular, this is history that's hard to find. There are not a lot of photographs of much of the buildings, and I like that the sketches are there's perfection in the imperfection. Like, what did you call it? Like wobbly? What?
Wiggly.
Wiggly. It's like it's perfect because it's capturing like the real thing, like the broken glass, the power lines, like that kind of Crumb-esque version, which I think makes it perfect. And that's life.
As a part of the Sweet Auburn Area Improvement Association back before the Olympics came, we had to go through and take a look at a couple of competitions that have been made on Auburn Avenue about how do we make this work? What do we need to do? The practicality of the matter was something very simple, and that was Georgia Power could not remove its power lines because people could not afford to put the power under the buildings. And so there are obstructions all over the place that add to the texture, but also make certain things you want to do rather irrelevant. And then the train comes through, and it lifts everything and does something quite different on a street that kind of needs it, but kind of doesn't necessarily need it. I mean, so Auburn Avenue has been resolved by a whole lot of stuff, and it keeps going. I mean, I think about my uncle's medical practice, which a quarter of the window is still there, being redone as a part of the Butler Y redo. And we actually owned the building where the big tree was, where the new Y was built. At least my aunt did. But over time, these things just shuffled around and moved around up and down, and some financier decides, well, this makes more sense. Let's make some money.
Well, one of the things I'm surprised about in this conversation, having been at Georgia Tech during my tenure as dean, is that I haven't heard the word innovation, because I think Georgia Tech is very proud of having innovative thinkers. And one of the things that I hear in this conversation is that there is the desire to think beyond the box, to figure out what can be done that might not have been thought of before. How can you make it work? And I think that what I'm hearing about the projects over here in the history of the traditional neighborhood is that we have buildings that emerge from the innovative thinking of people who had the resources that they had and the needs and desires that they did. And now, as a new generation of people who see some value in that same community, we have to do the same. And one of the things about the innovation of a drawing is that it helps you think about, because it doesn't try to capture in a stilted form what is there, but to give you an interpretation of what this young man sees as there and how he represents that and what that drawing helps him to think about as he is finding words to talk about that. And for us as readers to think about, oh, I didn't know that. That gives me another opportunity to think about something that I didn't know. So the most valuable thing to me today, Ellen, was you starting off with, I thought I knew that community and I didn't.
Yeah. And that is one of the blessings of your being a cultural editor. There was a lot of red ink on these pages, y'all. And in helping to ask questions that made me think more. Also, your class, I mean, Delirious New York, what does that have to do with this? Actually, a lot. This retroactive manifesto, in a way, And that the line about Rockefeller Center as the first building to broadcast itself, that planted a seed of like, these buildings have voices. I mean, and it's all the education, the mentorship, the experience, the community we're coming from, the practice, the diligence, it all comes together. But I think to Jackie's point, like to be looking for it is really important. And to if that comes in the form of innovation, wonderful.
And these buildings have voices. I mean, you know that WERD was the one place you could hear jazz in the South. And it's sun up to sundown. It was over. The Purple Grotto, Herb Lance. That's who we all introduced to jazz in Atlanta. There's no other place to hear it.
All right, I'm going to let Hassan give the last Q&A from the audience. We are almost out of time, and we've got a great buffet and book signing coming up. So, Hassan, last question. I'm going to ask for a quick reply.
All right. So the last question, we're going to talk about tech integrated into this idea of preservation. So the question is, media is under attack. Realities can be chosen. Do you think the digitalization of media helps or hinders the preservation of authentic memories?
I think they work in a symbiotic fashion. I mean, I wrote a thesis that I was like, there's no way that this is worth the paper it's written on. Because it was about what's the relationship between a virtual and real world to elevate both. But then you have something like a pandemic and you quickly realize that they can work together. And I mean, I think that the understanding of mediums is important to this question. It's possible with all of them to be used in some anti-fashion, but you can use it to come together for some common good.
And that really underscores that there is no magic answer to that, that there is an ethical dimension, there's a social dimension, there is the idea that the human brain has a capacity to come up with all kinds of stuff, but the human heart, the mind, and the soul has to decide how it should be used.
Well said. Absolutely. All right. I think everyone passed the quiz tonight. So, congratulations. Thank you. This was awesome. Thank you, Gene Kansas, Clay Kiningham, Bill Stanley, Jackie Royster, Hassan and Akram, and all of our attendees. You've been listening to episode 52 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. A video and podcast of this event will be posted to the Redesigning Cities website. Please consider subscribing to our YouTube and Podomatic channels, or whichever podcast platform you prefer. And now I'd like to welcome our in-person audience to continue the conversations informally during our reception with one more round of applause.